The hospital room was eerily quiet, except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. The sterile scent of disinfectant lingered in the air, and the harsh fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over the small, motionless figure in the hospital bed. Cashin, just 9 years old, lay wrapped in crisp white sheets, his frail body barely rising and falling with each shallow breath. The disease that plagued him was relentless, a cruel thief slowly draining the life from him. Doctors had exhausted every treatment, every experimental procedure. Now there was nothing left but waiting. His mother, Mireille, sat by his bedside, clutching his hand, though his fingers remained limp in her grasp. Her eyes were hollow, the weight of exhaustion and grief evident in the dark circles beneath them. She had spent endless nights in this hospital room, watching her son slip further away. Her husband, Thaddeus, stood near the window, staring out at the darkened city. He didn't speak. He only listened to the ticking clock, marking each second they lost. Then something happened, something no one could have expected. A faint, scratching noise came from the window. Mireille and Thaddeus exchanged puzzled glances. They were on the 3rd floor of a high-rise hospital, surrounded by glass and concrete. Nothing could be outside. And yet, there it was again, a soft but deliberate sound against the glass. Mireille's spine tingled as she turned her head toward the window. That was when she saw them, a pair of glowing amber eyes staring back at her from the darkness. Before she could react, the figure moved, leaping effortlessly into the room. A majestic lynx landed silently on the cold hospital floor, its golden fur dappled with dark spots, its tufted ears flicking with a quiet awareness. It didn't snarl. It didn't seem afraid. Instead, it moved with a purpose, as if it belonged there. The lynx padded closer to Cashin's bed, its piercing gaze fixed on the boy. Then, to the shock of his parents, it climbed onto the bed and lay down beside him. The room was frozen in stunned silence. Mireille could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Thaddeus took a slow step forward, his breath shallow. Then it happened. Cashin, who hadn't moved in weeks, twitched his fingers. Mireille gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Thaddeus's entire body stiffened, his eyes locked onto his son's fragile form. And then, as if waking from a long sleep, Cashin's eyes fluttered open. Why? You who love emotional stories. If this story has kept you hooked so far, just imagine what's coming next. Leave a like now to support the channel and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters. Turn on the notification bell because what happens next will surprise you. Mireille's breath hitched as she clutched Cashin's hand, her fingers trembling against his warm skin. For weeks, she had only felt cold lifelessness there, his tiny hands limp and unmoving. Now his fingers twitched, a faint but undeniable sign of life. His eyelids fluttered as if he were emerging from a deep sleep, and then, almost imperceptibly, his breathing changed. It was no longer shallow and uneven. There was depth to it now, a rhythm that had been absent for far too long. The lynx remained still, its body pressed against Cashin's side, golden eyes locked onto the boy's face with an intensity that sent shivers down Mireille's spine. Thaddeus, frozen in place near the window, could barely process what he was witnessing. His son had been deteriorating for months, slipping further and further away despite every desperate attempt to save him. And yet, here he was, stirring, breathing, alive, all while a wild lynx lay calmly beside him. Cashin? Thaddeus finally spoke, his voice hoarse and uncertain, as if he feared saying the name too loudly might shatter the fragile moment. The boy's lips parted slightly, as though he was trying to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Mireille's grip on his hand tightened, her pulse pounding in her ears. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors provided the only sound in the room, their pattern different now, more stable, more normal. Mireille's eyes flicked to the screen displaying Cashin's vitals. His heart rate, once dangerously erratic, had evened out. The oxygen levels that had required constant monitoring had climbed to a safer range. It was impossible. There was no logical reason for this sudden improvement. The only new factor in the room was the lynx, still curled beside Cashin, as if guarding him. Mireille's breath came in shaky gasps as she struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. The silence shattered when the door swung open, and a nurse stepped inside, clipboard in hand. She barely took 2 steps before she froze mid-motion, her eyes widening in sheer disbelief. "What they?" she stammered, her gaze darting between the enormous wildcat sprawled on the hospital bed and the boy who, just hours ago, had been unresponsive. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the clipboard, her entire body going rigid with tension. How did that thing get in here?" She finally choked out, her voice laced with panic. Before anyone could respond, Cashin's lips parted once more, and this time, a sound emerged. His voice was barely above a whisper, raspy from weeks of silence, but it was clear. "He found me." The words sent an eerie shudder through the room. Mireille's breath caught in her throat. Found him? What did that mean? The way Cashin said it wasn't just a simple statement, it was knowing, as if the lynx's presence wasn't random at all. Mireille and Thaddeus exchanged glances, unspoken questions swirling between them. Had the lynx really found him? Had it been searching for him all along? And most importantly, how had this animal done what even the best doctors in the world had failed to do? The weight of Cashin's words lingered in the air, thick with a meaning neither Mireille nor Thaddeus could yet comprehend. "He found me." It wasn't a simple observation, it was a statement filled with certainty, as if the boy and the lynx shared a connection beyond anything rational. Mireille's pulse pounded in her ears as she turned her gaze to the wild animal still nestled beside her son. The lynx showed no signs of aggression or unease. Instead, it remained utterly calm, its piercing amber eyes watching Cashin with something that almost resembled understanding. The nurse, still standing frozen at the door, finally seemed to snap out of her shock. I have to call security," she stammered, fumbling with the hospital's emergency pager. "That thing, it's dangerous. It shouldn't be here." Her voice cracked with alarm, her professional instincts fighting against the bizarre reality before her. But before she could press the button, Cashin, who had barely moved in weeks, shifted slightly in the bed, his frail hand weakly reaching out toward her. "Please." His voice was hoarse, but there was an unmistakable urgency in it. The nurse hesitated, her thumb hovering over the call button. "Don't make him leave," Cashin whispered. His eyes, dull and exhausted just minutes ago, now held a flicker of something Mireille hadn't seen in far too long: hope. It was as if the presence of the lynx had given him something medicine couldn't: strength. Mireille swallowed hard, torn between reason and the unexplainable. Every instinct told her that keeping a wild predator in a hospital room was madness, but she couldn't ignore what was happening in front of her. Cashin was getting better. The monitors proved it. His body, moments ago frail and lifeless, was responding. She turned to the nurse, her voice unsteady. "Please, just wait." Thaddeus, who had remained eerily quiet, finally spoke. "He shouldn't even be able to move," he murmured almost to himself. His eyes flicked between his son and the lynx, his mind racing through every possible explanation. But there was none. This wasn't science. This wasn't medicine. It was something else entirely. The lynx, as if sensing the weight of the moment, lifted its head and met Thaddeus's gaze. The golden eyes didn't belong to a mindless animal. There was intent in them, something deeper, something impossible to dismiss. And as Cashin's breathing continued to steady, as warmth returned to his fragile body, one thing became terrifyingly clear. This was no ordinary animal. The room was thick with tension, the air so charged that even the steady beeping of the monitors felt distant. The nurse stood frozen, her fingers still hovering over the emergency button, her face torn between duty and the undeniable reality unfolding before her. Mireille could see the battle in the woman's eyes. Protocol demanded she call security, remove the animal, restore order. But how could she? How could anyone look at Cashin, at the way color had returned to his cheeks, the way his chest rose and fell with newfound strength, and not believe the lynx had something to do with it? Cashin's small fingers remained curled in the lynx's thick fur, his breathing steady, deeper than it had been in months. His voice, though still weak, broke the silence. "He's here for a reason." His tone wasn't questioning. It wasn't the words of a child making wild assumptions. It was a quiet certainty that sent a chill through Mireille's spine. She tightened her grip on her son's hand, her heart pounding against her ribs. Thaddeus exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face. "A reason?" he repeated, his voice carefully measured, as if afraid to believe. His rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that a wild lynx appearing in the middle of a hospital was already beyond explanation. But Cashin's recovery? That was something no science could account for. He glanced at the lynx, which remained unervingly still, its golden eyes flicking between each of them as if it understood everything being said. The nurse finally lowered the pager, her fingers trembling slightly. "I don't understand what's happening here," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't deny what I'm seeing." She took a hesitant step closer, her gaze flickering to the monitors. The vitals had stabilized, the numbers showing signs of strength Cashin shouldn't have had. She turned to Mireille and Thaddeus, her expression torn. "If I don't call security and something happens?" She let the unspoken words hang between them. Mireille swallowed hard, glancing at her son. "Nothing is going to happen," she said, her voice firmer now. "Look at him. Look at the numbers. Whatever this lynx is, whatever it's doing." She took a breath. "It's helping him." The words felt impossible coming out of her mouth, yet she knew they were true. She felt it. Cashin blinked slowly, exhaustion still weighing on him, but his grip on the lynx's fur didn't loosen. His lips parted, as if to say more. But before he could, the lynx did something that made everyone's breath catch in their throats. It lifted its head, stared directly at Cashin, and let out a deep, low chuffing sound, almost like a whisper meant only for him. The sound that came from the lynx was unlike anything they had ever heard before. It wasn't a growl, nor was it a purr. It was something in between, a deep, resonant chuff that sent a vibration through the air. It filled the room with an eerie presence, something ancient, something that didn't belong to the sterile walls of a hospital. Cashin's body shivered slightly at the sound, but not from fear. Instead, his fingers curled tighter into the thick fur of the animal, as if drawn to it, as if he understood something the rest of them didn't. Mireille held her breath, watching her son with wide eyes. For weeks, she had prepared herself for the worst, watching as his small body wasted away. Now he was awake, aware, and more present than he had been in months. And it was all because of this impossible creature lying beside him. Thaddeus took a slow step forward, his shoulders tense, his mind struggling to catch up with what his eyes were witnessing. "What the hell is happening?" His voice came out rough, edged with disbelief but also something deeper, fear. He prided himself on being a logical man, someone who trusted science and facts. But there was no rational explanation for what he was seeing. His son, his dying son, was holding onto a lynx, an animal that shouldn't even be in this part of the country, let alone inside a hospital, let alone causing his vitals to improve before their eyes. Thaddeus clenched his jaw and exhaled sharply, trying to suppress the rising dread inside him. "Cashin," he said, his voice lower now, more careful. "What do you mean, he's here for a reason?" Cashin blinked, his breathing steady, his fingers never leaving the lynx's fur. There was a quiet certainty in his gaze, something eerie for a child so young. "He's been looking for me?" he murmured, as if the answer should have been obvious. The words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Mireille's stomach twisted at the way he said it. So calmly, so sure. She exchanged a glance with Thaddeus, whose face had gone pale. The hospital room, despite the beeping of the monitors and the hum of machines, felt like it had fallen into an unnatural stillness. The nurse standing by the door swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of her clipboard like it was the only thing keeping her upright. This isn't possible," she muttered under her breath. But she didn't reach for her emergency pager this time. She had seen too much. She had watched Cashin's vitals on the screen, seen the numbers change the moment the lynx appeared. None of it made sense, yet there was no denying what was in front of her. Her voice shook as she continued, "Wild animals don't just show up in hospitals, and they definitely don't." She gestured helplessly at Cashin, her fingers trembling. "Do whatever this is." Mireille's throat felt dry as she turned back to her son. "Cashin?" she whispered, brushing a strand of damp hair from his forehead, her heart hammering against her ribs. "How do you know that? How do you know he was looking for you?" The words barely left her lips before Cashin slowly turned his head, his deep, exhausted eyes locking onto hers. And then he spoke in a voice so soft, yet so certain, that it made her blood run cold. "Because," Cashin whispered, his fingers tightening in the lynx's fur, "I saw him in my dreams." What do you think is happening here? Is the lynx just an animal, or is there something more, something supernatural? Mireille felt a chill run down her spine at Cashin's words. "I saw him in my dreams." The boy's voice was quiet but certain, as if he had just revealed a long-held secret. Her fingers instinctively tightened around his hand, searching for warmth, for something tangible to hold onto as the world around her started to feel increasingly surreal. She glanced at Thaddeus, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but his face was unreadable. His jaw clenched, his gaze flickering between their son and the lynx that had impossibly appeared in their lives. Thaddeus took a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. "Cashin, what do you mean?" His voice was careful, measured, like he was speaking to someone balancing on the edge of something fragile. "You dreamed about him before tonight?" His rational mind screamed that this was just the hallucination of a sick child, a product of fever or exhaustion. But Cashin wasn't delirious. He was more present than he had been in months. Cashin turned his head slightly toward his father, his expression unwavering. "Not just once," he said, his voice hoarse but clear. "I've been seeing him for a long time, before I got really sick, before I even came to the hospital." He swallowed hard, his fingers still gripping the lynx's fur. "He was always there, in the woods waiting." His words sent another shiver through Mireille's body. The nurse, who had remained silent until now, took an uneasy step forward, her face pale. "Cashin, honey," she said, forcing a small, nervous smile. "You were dreaming. You've been asleep for a long time, and when people are sick, sometimes their minds." No, Cashin's voice, though weak, cut through the room like a blade. "It wasn't just a dream." His chest rose and fell heavily as he struggled for breath, but his eyes burned with something fierce. "Every time it felt real. I could feel the wind. I could hear the trees. He would watch me from the edge of the forest, waiting." He hesitated, then looked down at the lynx beside him. "I just didn't know that he was real." The lynx remained still, its golden eyes reflecting the dim hospital light, never breaking its gaze from Cashin. It wasn't just an animal. It wasn't lost. It had come here for a reason. And now, as Cashin whispered those final words, Mireille realized with a sinking feeling in her chest. It had come because he called it. Mireille's breath was shallow as she stared at her son, her mind racing through his words. He was always there, in the woods waiting. The weight of that statement pressed against her chest. How could Cashin have dreamed about this lynx? This exact lynx. Long before he ever got sick. She tried to rationalize it, but no logic could explain what was happening. The boy lying in that hospital bed had been on the brink of death. Yet now he was awake, stronger, and connected to this creature in a way none of them could understand. Thaddeus, standing rigid at the foot of the bed, exhaled slowly, his hands clenched into fists. "Cashin," he said carefully, his voice tight with something between fear and disbelief. "What exactly did you see in those dreams?" He wanted to believe this was just a coincidence, the imagination of a sick child desperate for comfort. But deep down, something gnawed at him, a feeling he had never been able to shake since the moment the lynx appeared. This wasn't just a dream. This wasn't just an animal. Cashin hesitated for a moment, his fingers still tangled in the lynx's fur, as if drawing strength from its presence. His voice was quieter this time, more distant. I was in the forest, he murmured. It was always the same place. Tall trees, so many I couldn't see the sky. I could hear the wind, the leaves rustling, and... He glanced at the lynx, his expression unreadable. And I knew I wasn't alone. He was always there, just beyond the trees, watching me. His lips pressed together before he added, not chasing me, not hunting me, waiting. A thick silence filled the room, broken only by the steady beeping of the monitors. The nurse, still standing hesitantly near the door, swallowed hard. Cashin, she said gently, clearly trying to keep her voice steady. Did you ever go into the forest? In real life, before you got sick? Her question carried the same unspoken fear that Mireille felt twisting in her stomach. What if these weren't just dreams? What if something had been calling Cashin all along? Cashin's lips parted slightly, but for the first time since the lynx appeared, he looked uncertain. His gaze flickered between his parents and the animal beside him before he finally whispered, I don't remember. The lynx shifted then, its ears twitching, its golden eyes locking onto Cashin's with something almost expectant. Mireille's heart pounded harder. She didn't know why, but she suddenly had the overwhelming sense that Cashin was supposed to remember, that whatever had brought the lynx here wasn't finished yet. Cashin's words hung in the air like a dense fog. I don't remember. Mireille felt a cold shiver run through her as she studied her son's face. There was something unsettling about the way he said it. Not like a child struggling to recall an old memory, but like someone who had once known the truth and had it taken from him. The lynx remained perfectly still beside him, its golden eyes locked onto his, watching, waiting. The tension in the room was suffocating. Thaddeus ran a hand through his hair, his expression darkening. Cashin, try, he urged, his voice firmer now. You told us you saw the lynx in your dreams before you got sick. If this animal was waiting for you, why? What happened in the forest? His rational mind rejected the absurdity of the question even as he asked it, but instinct told him that Cashin's illness, the lynx, and these dreams, they were all connected. Cashin's fingers tightened around the lynx's fur as his brows furrowed in concentration. He hesitated, his breath quickening slightly. His eyes darted back and forth as if searching for something just out of reach, something buried deep within his mind. I think I was there. His voice wavered. Not in a dream. For real. His head snapped up, and Mireille saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear. Mireille's throat went dry. Cashin, when were you there? She didn't want to push him, but a deep, gnawing dread had taken root in her chest. Had her son wandered off into the woods alone? Had something happened to him there? Something that no one had known about? The very thought made her stomach churn. The heart monitor beeped steadily beside them, the only sound in the heavy silence. Cashin's breathing hitched, and his grip on the lynx tensed. I don't. He shut his eyes tightly, shaking his head. It's like, I was there, but then I wasn't. Like something pulled me away. I don't remember coming home. I don't remember getting sick. His voice cracked as he finally met his mother's gaze. But I know the lynx was there. Mireille's heart pounded. She reached for Thaddeus's hand, gripping it tightly as a terrible realization settled over her. Cashin's illness hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. Something had happened in that forest. And now, with the lynx beside him once more, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had started there wasn't over yet. Cashin's breathing grew uneven, his small fingers curling tighter into the lynx's fur. His face twisted in frustration, like someone trying to grasp a memory just beyond reach. Mireille felt her own pulse quicken. Her son had been sick for so long that she had stopped questioning what had caused it, stopped searching for answers because the doctors had none. But now, as she looked into Cashin's wide, frightened eyes, she realized the truth had been waiting all along, buried in his lost memories, and the lynx had come to bring it back. Thaddeus took a slow step closer, his throat tightening. Cashin, he said carefully, his voice lower now, almost afraid of what the boy might say next. When you say something pulled you away, do you mean from the forest? Do you remember anything? Asterisk asterisk anything at all. Asterisk asterisk before you got sick. His fingers clenched at his sides. He had spent months watching his son slip further and further away, helpless to stop it. But now, standing here, he felt a terrible certainty creeping over him. Cashin hadn't just gotten sick. Something had taken something from him. The lynx lifted its head slightly, its ears twitching, eyes locked onto Cashin. It wasn't just listening, it was waiting. Cashin swallowed hard, his breathing shallow. "I was walking," he whispered, his eyes distant, as if he were watching the scene unfold behind them, in some space only he could see. It was so quiet, no birds, no wind, just stillness. And then, his lips parted slightly, his voice trembling. "I saw something." Mireille felt her fingers dig into her own palms, but she didn't dare interrupt. The air in the room felt heavier, as if something unseen had wrapped around them. Listening too, Cashin's voice wavered. It wasn't the lynx. It was something else. Something wrong. He squeezed his eyes shut as if the memory burned. "I don't know what it was. I just remember the feeling, like I wasn't supposed to be there, like something saw me." His voice cracked, and then everything went dark. The nurse took a shaky step back, her breath uneven. This wasn't just a lost memory. This wasn't just a coincidence. Mireille's stomach twisted as she looked at the lynx, its golden eyes reflecting something deep, something ancient. It had come for Cashin, to protect him. But from what? Cashin's grip on the lynx loosened slightly as he exhaled, his hands trembling. His gaze slowly lifted to meet his mother's, filled with fear and something else, something colder. "Mom," he whispered, "I think it's still waiting for me." Mireille's breath caught in her throat. "I think it's still waiting for me." Cashin's words settled over the room like a thick fog, suffocating, inescapable. The steady beeping of the monitors faded into the background as she stared at her son, searching his face for something, anything, that would make this make sense. But Cashin wasn't delirious. He wasn't feverish. He was more present than he had been in months. And yet, the fear in his voice was real. Something had been in that forest with him. And it wasn't the lynx. Thaddeus swallowed hard, his entire body tense. "Cashin," he said slowly, his voice measured. "Whatever happened to you out there, you're here now. You're safe." He glanced at the lynx, its golden eyes still locked onto the boy. And he made sure of that. But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. Because if the lynx had come back, did that mean something else had, too? Cashin's fingers twitched in the lynx's fur. He shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, it's not over." He hesitated, as if forcing himself to speak the next words. "It never left me. It just took something. And now it wants me back." A deep shudder ran through his small frame. "I can feel it." Mireille's heart pounded so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She reached for his hand, gripping it tight. "No one is taking you anywhere," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "You're here, with us." The lynx suddenly shifted, standing on the bed with an eerie grace. It turned toward the window, ears twitching, eyes locked onto something unseen beyond the glass. The hair on Mireille's arms stood on end. It knew something they didn't, could feel something coming. The nurse took a shaky step back, her face pale. "What is it doing?" she whispered. But no one had an answer. For a long moment, no one moved. The air felt thick, charged with something unseen. And then Cashin exhaled sharply, a deep, shuddering breath, as if something invisible had just lifted off his chest. His whole body slackened, his eyes fluttering shut for a brief moment before opening again. When he spoke, his voice was different, lighter, stronger. "It's gone," he murmured. He blinked up at the lynx, his hand still resting against its fur. "You sent it away." Mireille let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. She turned to Thaddeus, barely able to process what had just happened. The lynx slowly stepped down from the bed, padding silently toward the door, paused, looking back at Cashin one last time. And in that moment, Mireille understood. The lynx had never been lost. It had never been a coincidence. It had come for Cashin because it was the only thing standing between him and whatever had taken him that day in the forest. And now its job was done. If you enjoyed this story and want more thrilling content like this, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring even more incredible stories to you. Leave a comment. What do you think about Cashin's connection with the lynx? Do you believe there are things science can't explain? Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. Liked it? Then hit the like button. It motivates us to keep bringing you more amazing content.